Somewhere between 2020 and today, an entire generation of engineers quietly became permanently junior. Nobody announced it, nobody had to. There is a particular kind of institutional lie that never gets spoken out loud. It doesn't need to be, it operates through silence, through shifted goalposts, through the slow rewriting of what words mean. The word in question here is promotion, and what happened to it inside the largest technology companies in the world is one of the clearest examples we have of a system that failed not because nobody understood it, but because understanding it was inconvenient. Let's go back to 2020, not to the pandemic itself, but to what the pandemic allowed. When hiring exploded, and it did explode, at a scale that felt almost irrational even at the time, companies needed bodies. They needed engineers, product managers, data scientists, and they needed them fast. To compete, they inflated levels. An engineer who would have entered at L3 at Google in 2018 was entering at L4 in 2021. Someone who would have been hired as a mid-level at Meta was being brought in as senior. The levels didn't change on paper. The humans assigned to those levels did. And inside every one of those companies, someone knew exactly what that meant for the people already there. The warning sign was not subtle. It was almost embarrassingly visible. When you compress the gap between entry level and senior by inflating where new hires land, you mathematically narrow the room at the top. Every L4 hired externally at L4 is a body that doesn't need to be promoted from L3. Every senior hired directly is a justification, however quiet, for why the internal L4 who has been waiting 2 years hasn't moved yet. The ladder didn't get longer. It got more crowded at every rung. In the internal documents that would later circulate, in the Reddit threads, in the blind posts, in the anonymous surveys that HR commissioned and then quietly shelved, the pattern was already visible by mid-2021. Average time to promotion was beginning to lengthen. Calibration meetings were getting harder. The bar, people were told, had been raised. What they were not told was that the bar had been raised partly because the room was full of people hired over it. But here is where the story gets darker, because this is where the second warning sign appears. Companies knew that remote work had changed something about visibility. They had data on it, studies commissioned internally, some of which have since leaked or been referenced in earnings calls, showed clearly that remote engineers received fewer promotion-supporting interactions. Fewer spontaneous endorsements in hallway conversations that no longer existed, fewer opportunities to be seen solving a problem in real time by someone with the power to advocate for them. The architecture of promotion had always been partly social. Remote work had not eliminated that architecture. It had made it invisible to the people who needed it most while leaving it intact for those who already had it. This was documented. This was known. And the response, in most cases, was to add a line to the promotion rubric about cross-functional impact, a phrase so perfectly designed to mean everything and nothing that it became, in practice, a reason to delay rather than a path to advance. By 2022, the average time to promotion from L4 to L5 at a major tech company had grown by somewhere between 30 and 60%, depending on the organization and the function. The numbers were tracked. They were discussed in people operations meetings. They showed up in attrition analysis. Engineers were leaving, not in the dramatic, visible way they would later leave during the layoff cycles, but quietly, one at a time, joining smaller companies where the math was better and the room less crowded. And then 2023 arrived. The layoffs began. And when they did not fall evenly. Mid-level engineers, the L4s and L5s who had been waiting, accumulating tenure without accumulating titles, were disproportionately affected. Not because they were performing poorly. The performance review data in many cases showed the opposite, but because they occupied an awkward position, expensive enough to matter to a headcount reduction, junior enough to be framed as non-critical, and crucially, so now what, without the organizational gravity that comes with a title that makes you hard to remove. The system had lengthened the time to promotion, and then it had punished the people caught in the gap. What we are left with now is not a broken ladder. It is a ladder that is functioning exactly as the incentives required it to function. Promotion timelines extended because extension served the short-term interests of organizations managing headcount costs without making explicit decisions. The engineers at the bottom of a lengthened timeline absorbed the cost. They absorbed it in delayed compensation. They absorbed it in delayed authority. And some of them absorbed it in a layoff notice that arrived at the end of a quarter where the company beat earnings estimates. Here is the universal implication, and it is the one that should unsettle you regardless of what industry you work in. When a system silently changes the rules and continues to use the old language, it is not an accident. It is a choice. And the people who bear the cost of that choice are almost never the people who made it.